Welcome to Doc NYC and the special Q&A for MLK FBI. I'm Tom Powers, the festival's artistic director. I'm pleased to have the film's director, Sam Pollard, joining us from New York. This year, Sam is also the recipient of Doc NYC's Lifetime Achievement Award, recognizing his deep body of work spanning several decades. Sam, let me start by asking you about David Garrow, the historian that first gave the inspiration to this project. Can you talk about the work of David Garrow that got you going?
Ben Hedden, who's the producer of the film, had read the book that David had written about King and his relationship with J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI, and he said to me, "I think this should be our next film." We had just finished a few years before the film Two Trains Running, and I read the book. I was very familiar with David Garrow because he had been one of our major consultants when I was on Eyes on the Prize too. He had written the Pulitzer Prize-winning book Bearing the Cross about Dr. King and the SCLC, so I knew his background. And after I read the book, I reached out to Ben and said, "You're absolutely correct. This is going to be a way to look at King and J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI and the US government in a different light." So we reached out to David about over 2.5 years ago and asked if we could come to Pittsburgh, where he lives, and sit down with him and with a camera crew and do a 4-hour interview. And he consented. And he was extremely, extremely informative and very helpful. And after that, we put together a sizzle reel to look to try to raise the funds. And quite honestly, we got a lot of rejections until Synetic got involved, repping the film, repping us. And they were able to bring two very important funders to help get this project off the ground, Field of Vision and Play Action. And with their support, their financial and creative support, we were able to get the film shot and put into the can. And pretty much on the fall of 2019, we did the rest of the interviews with two of our historians, Donna Murch and Beverly Gage, and we interviewed two of King's very important lieutenants, Clarence Jones and Andy Young. And then we were able to get an interview with a former FBI agent, Charles Knox. And then we were also able to do an audio interview with James Comey. And so that was sort of the bulk of the interviews. And then we hired a wonderful archivist, archival producer named Brian Becker, who put together a phenomenal archive. And then we brought in this editor who had done the sizzle reel, Laura Tomaselli, who I have to say was from one editor to another. She did an extraordinary job.
Let me ask you about that because you do have a deep career as an editor, worked with Spike Lee on several films and many, many other people. What is that like for you to let go of the editing reins and turn them over to someone else?
Quite honestly, Tom, it's an absolute pleasure. It's wonderful to see young talent who can sit down and negotiate lots of material, lots of interviews, and understand the process of shaping story and the editing process. And, as an editor, when I was editing, I always loved the ability to be able to have the director step away and let me have a first pass at shaping the arc of the story and then coming in and giving me his or her feedback. And I try to do that with the editors I work with now. I like to give them the ability to be able to create and then to give them feedback when they show me stuff. We talk about the template of the story, the direction of the story, the arc of the story, but then I say, here are the transcripts, here are my selects, but give it some vision, give it some, some perspective that I may not have considered. And I like that process a lot. I don't like the idea of sitting over an editor's shoulder because I never liked some director sitting over my shoulder telling me where to cut, what to cut. I like that sort of give and take. And I think Laura did a wonderful, extraordinary job.
I mean, since we're talking about it, can you point to anything that she really brought forward in shaping the film or a scene that really has her fingerprints on it?
Exactly. There's one that's really fascinating. Ben and I had talked at the beginning of doing the film without anybody on camera. All the interviews would be audio. And we got some pushback that people said, "Well, you sure you should do that?" And, we had seen some of these other films that nowadays just do audio interviews. I had been very influenced by a film, which you probably remember, the Black Power mixtapes, which is all audio. So but to be careful, to be safe, we decided not to just do audio interviews. We shot everybody on camera just in case no one would like these audio. But the one thing that Laura did that we hadn't considered was bringing all the people on camera at the end of the film in the epilogue. And when she put together the first cut and we got to the end, Ben and I both were like, what? Now we see the people? And we thought it was just such a great sort of like surprise to bring them on camera at the end to give us so the audience would know who was actually had been speaking throughout the film. And that was her idea. I have to take my hat off and say that was her idea. It wasn't my idea. And the other thing that she was really good at doing, which I had sort of been resistant about, was the material where we had Dr. King on the Merv Griffin show with Harry Belafonte. Initially, I thought, well, okay, what's that going to mean to the film? I mean, we're really trying to dig into the parallels between King and his trajectory as a civil rights activist and J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI monitoring his every move. But she felt really strongly that we wanted to see something emotional and personal about King. So she really fought for that sequence, and she added some elements to it. The home movie footage that Brian found of King with his parents and with the kids, some of those stills of the King with his family that people have not seen before playing with his kids. Those were elements that she brought that I thought were very fascinating and important.
So I recently interviewed Yoruba Richin, who made the film The Sit-In when Harry Belafonte was on The Tonight Show, and there's a scene with Martin Luther King Jr. And one of the points that Yoruba made to me is that Martin Luther King Jr. wasn't on TV a lot. He didn't do a lot of those shows like Merv Griffin. Today we think of him as an iconic personality that anyone would have been chasing to have on their TV show, but it just wasn't true.
No, he wasn't. He wasn't the iconic figure that everyone loved back in the 60s. One of the interesting things in the film is that section where Hoover called King a notorious liar, and they took a poll about who was more popular, Hoover or Dr. King. And 50% of the people that were polled thought that Hoover was very popular, and only 15% thought that King was popular. And then when you listen to those man on the street interviews, a couple of the people, the older white gentleman who says, Hoover says King is terrible, but I think he's 10 times worse. And then the white woman who says, I don't like King because he's uppity. Well, you realize that he wasn't so heroic and loved by everybody in America as he is today.
Now, you've been immersed in a lot of civil rights projects over the decades, including Eyes on the Prize 2, as you mentioned. You've had a lot of opportunities professionally and I'm sure personally to think about Martin Luther King Jr. and his legacy. I wondered, going into this project, what were you looking for? What were you trying to answer for yourself about Martin Luther King Jr. that you hadn't had answers to before?
I think one of the things that I was hoping that we would, take away from this film, that he was a human being, that he was much more complicated than just the guy who was, became of age at the Montgomery bus boycott and went on to go to Birmingham and have the I Have a Dream speech at the March on Washington. He was a much more complicated human being in that he had to deal with personal issues as he was dealing with this, historic social movement. And the thing that I have found as a documentarian over the years is that the thing that I like about doing these kind of films now, these historical docs, is it gives me an opportunity to really dig into people and see how much more complicated they are than you first assumed they were. I mean, if I had done this film almost 30 years ago, I probably would have done the one sort of, King was great. He had the I Have a Dream speech. He said, let's bring white kids and black kids together, free at last, free at last. Thank God Almighty, we're free at last. And that's how you would want to remember him. And some of my earlier films, that's probably all I did. But now I'm always looking at how to look at on another level, to look into complexities and the nuances of these people. Be it King, be it Maynard Jackson, be it Sammy Davis Jr.
Yeah, that's so interesting to think about that. I want to talk about J. Edgar Hoover for a minute. You use all this, footage from Hollywood movies that were pumping up the FBI as a great organization. To some extent, you grew up with that kind of media bath around you. What did you think of J. Edgar Hoover as you were growing up, and how did that change over the years?
drank the Kool-Aid, Tom. I drank the Kool-Aid. He was the guy who had the G-men, Jimmy Cagney, Big Jim McClain with John Wayne, James Stewart in the FBI story. These were the guys who were upholding the American values,
And you
fighting.
love those movies. I know that you're a big movie buff,
I,
so
I loved them all. I bought into it. I bought into the mythology. I used to watch weekly the FBI story with Efren Zimbalist Jr. I bought into the mythology. And America is very seductive in making you believe what they want you to believe. And luckily, I'm a curious human being. I'm a filmmaker. So I learned to look behind those things and see that it's much more complicated. It's not so easy. It's not so, cut and dry, so black and white about the FBI and their legacy and who J. Edgar Hoover was and what the FBI was doing. The thing that I find kind of ironic in this age of Trump is how he so denigrates the FBI now that those of us who are liberal and democratic see the FBI as maybe a beholder of some sort of truth that he doesn't uphold. It's ironic to me.
a lot of shifting perspectives going
Absolutely, absolutely.
on. So the film had its world premiere in September at the Toronto Film Festival. It's been rolling out at some other film festivals. What has struck you about the way audiences are receiving the film?
The thing that's been very, very, very eye-opening is how people are making the connection to what's going on in America today. Every one of these reviews and people I've spoken to are making that connection, which I'm glad they are, because a lot of the things that you see and hear in that film are still being talked about and seen in America today. And I like that. I like that it's really having that kind of resonance, and impact. But someone suggested that we should send a cut to the FBI. We should send a link to Christopher Wray at the FBI and give it to these young agents so they could see what Hoover was like back then, the FBI was like back then. But the thing that's also interesting too is that and I know that the FBI is probably still very active in doing the kind of things that they did in the 60s with informants and bugging, and scrutinizing organizations like Black Lives Matter. Trust me.
Yes, I think there's no doubt about that. And, maybe it's going to take another 20 years before we really get a clear picture on that.
Absolutely.
So for my last question, let me ask you about the FBI members that you spoke to for this project. What were those conversations like?
Well, we went to Texas to interview Charles Knox, a former FBI agent who came in, who joined the FBI in the mid to late 60s at the tail end of the surveillance of King. So he was aware of some of these men who had been involved, agents who had been involved in surveilling King. And what I found fascinating about him was that even though he had been an FBI agent for many, many years, he has what I called sort of cleared-eyed perspective about the pros and cons of the FBI. Now, if the agency listened to his transcript, they may not be very happy with him because he seemed to be very honest about the FBI and what they do and don't do. And he's the one person who said in the epilogue he wasn't sure that the tapes in 2027 should be revealed, So I found that fascinating. We did a 2-hour interview with him, and everything he said, I was like on the edge of my seat. I thought he was so interesting. And the thing that was also interesting, though, Tom, his ex-wife, he had met her because she was an FBI agent too. She was one of the first Latinas to be in the FBI agency.
Wow.
So fascinating man.
Wow. Well, it sounds like there's, more. Maybe there's more to be done with some of your outtakes sometime in the future.
Always.
But we really thank you for being part of Doc NYC this year, and thank you for this film.
Thank you for having me.